Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, any other agency of the U.S. government, or any institutions with which our guests may be affiliated. So today we are going to be keep looking at Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, which has been the focus of the broadcast here for about 2 months now. But our topic today is one that we haven't really delved into yet. It's the dog that didn't bark, or rather it's barked in a very different way than many people have expected. And before I butcher the analogy anymore, I'll go ahead and get to our panel introductions here, because we're very excited to have them help us examine the cyber aspects of this conflict, what both Russia and Ukraine have done that our panelists did not expect, lessons from those activities for U.S. cyber strategy, and how the PME community needs to respond to these revelations. So our panelists are, I'll start out with Dr. Sean Lawson. He's an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah, as well as one of our non-resident fellows here through the Krulak Center. He's the author of Cybersecurity Discourse in the United States, Cyber Doom Rhetoric and Beyond, released in 2020 by Routledge, and just released a new book with Robert Gell titled Social Engineering: How Crowdmasters, Freaks, Hackers, and Trolls Created a New Form of Manipulative Communication, and that's from MIT Press. Dr. Carl C.J. Horn is a professor of cyberspace strategy and warfare with the Air Force Cyber College. Prior to his arrival in sunny Montgomery, Alabama, C.J. was at the College of Information and Cyberspace, where he led the creation and execution of the nation's only war college program centered on cyberspace warfare. He also served more than 24 years in the U.S. Army as an armor officer and strategist. You have Dr. Melissa Thomas, who is a research professor of cyber warfare and strategy at the Air Force Cyber College as well. So we have two individuals from there. We're very grateful for that support. Dr. Jacquelyn Schneider is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and her research focuses on the intersection of technology, national security, and political psychology with a special interest in cybersecurity, unmanned technologies, and Northeast Asia. She's non-resident fellow at the Naval War College's Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute and a senior policy advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And for those who followed the broadcast for the last couple of years, our moderator needs no introduction, but we want to make sure we introduce him anyway. Dr. Brandon Valeriano is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and was formerly a senior advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. He is also one of our Krulak Center's distinguished fellows and previously held the Donald Bren Chair for Military Innovation here at Marine Corps University. As a Bren Chair, he was a key part of helping facilitate our first season of Broadcast episodes, so we're very happy to see him back again on the show. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the panel, and Dr. Valeriano, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Major Brown. Glad to be here, glad to be doing this. As we say in the military, we are a big fan of joint service examinations and evaluations here, and that's really the key. So this panel will be made up of some Krulak fellows. Dr. Schneider can, explain her relationship to the military, but I believe you still are in active reserve. And we have two professors from the Air Force Cyber College here. And this obviously is an unprecedented moment. A lot of people were expecting outright cyber warfare, and that's not exactly what happened. And there's something to be said about the quality and analysis that has come from the PME community that I wanted to really highlight here. But this panel, this session will really just be focused on there's three simple questions to the panel. And then we're going to kick it out to questions to everyone else in the audience, because I know you guys have a lot of questions, a lot of things you want to clarify or examine. And there's a lot of push and pull in this field. And cybersecurity as a field is really exciting. So I encourage you all to join us. But the first question is fairly obvious. Many people seem to expect that Ukraine, that cyber warfare in Ukraine would play out a different way. There were quite a few articles, including one by Jay Healy, that suggested that cyber would be a surprise and that it would redefine warfare. And Rand pushed out an article that talked about cyber shock and awe campaigns. And we almost saw the exact opposite happen. Not that there weren't cyber events and there weren't cyber attacks, there were a few, and then we can talk about them and we can analyze them. But I'm curious for the panel, watching this war play out over the last month, obviously with horror and dread and fear for the civilian population, but also watching it from the professional perspective and given what our jobs are. What happened during this war in cyberspace that you did not expect? What caught you off guard? And particularly for Sean Lawson, what did you think about predictions that this might be our cyber Pearl Harbor moment? So given that, I'll kick it to Dr. Lawson first.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, no cyber Pearl Harbor. I guess this is where I get to say I told you so, right? I think that's what you wanted me to say, right? No, you didn't want me to say that? Okay. Well, but I did. I did tell you so. But that said, though, even though I'm sort of known for the anti-cyber, as being the like anti-cyber Pearl Harbor guy, the anti-cyber doom guy, I literally wrote a book on that. Even still, the lack of like larger scale cyber attacks was even a little bit surprising to me. Even though I've been skeptical for a really long time whether we're really going to see a lot of like cyber attacks that cause mass disruption or destruction, and even if we did see those larger scale attacks, like what the strategic effect of those would really be, whether that would really have a positive effect, in terms of whoever it was that was carrying out that attack and sort of advancing their strategy. But like many others, I thought that if there was ever going to be a chance that we would see such attacks, that this would be it. But so far, at least, it really hasn't happened. We have seen some attacks, like you said, that are pretty significant. And as Professor Tom Ridd wrote a couple weeks ago now, the satellite hacking that we saw with the Viasat, but for the fact that people are actually dying because of bombs and missiles, that probably would have been a hack that would have gotten a lot of attention from all of us, right? And we'd all be talking about it. But, in the grand scheme of things of what we've seen, we haven't really been talking about it too much, right? With everything else that's going on. I think a lot of this could be due to the effectiveness of Ukraine's defenses, which I think have surprised a lot of people in general, right? Just like they're doing much better in the kinetic fight than most anticipated, they seem to be doing better in the cyber component of the fight as well, which I think has surprised a lot of us. And I think a lot of that comes down to the third thing that's been, I think, a bit of a surprise for me and other people, and that's the rapid mobilization of third parties. Even before the crisis, of course, we do know that the U.S., Europeans, private companies like Microsoft were helping to shore up Ukrainian cyber defenses, and that appears to have been, a success to this point. But after the launch of the full-scale invasion, we also saw the rebirth of, hacktivist group Anonymous, and other groups join in the fight on both sides, but I think most notably to this point, in support of Ukraine. So, I remember joking early on that, if you had the reemergence of Anonymous on your cyber war bingo card, go ahead and mark it, because we hadn't heard a whole lot from that group in the last 10 years. And suddenly, they're back and they at least claim to be hacking, everything under the sun in Russia. And then fourth and finally, while Ukraine has done better in the information and propaganda component of the fight than Russia, I think, has done so far, and they've done better than a lot of people have expected. Nonetheless, I think it is sort of surprising that the Russians continue to do quite well with the American far right, which I found a little bit surprising. I mean, it just seems so obvious to me that Putin and the Russians are in the wrong here, that they're the bad guys, and so it's sort of surprising to see folks, trying to score domestic political points off the back of Russian propaganda. The ridiculous biolab story in particular seems to have gained a surprising amount of traction and has even been migrating into the more sort of mainstream conservative political discourse just in the last week or so. And so I find that a little bit surprising, again, because it just seems so obvious to me that, that Putin and the Russians are the bad guy here. So, yeah, so those are sort of the four things that have sort of been sort of surprising to me.
Great, thank you. I would follow up and ask you, are you really surprised that Glenn Greenwald is carrying water for Putin? But I think we'll avoid that question. Dr. Thomas, let me toss it to you next. Then we'll go to CJ, and Jackie will finish us off.
Thank you. Well, I think Dr. Lawson hit a number of points that I was also prepared to raise. I don't think I was expecting a cyber Pearl Harbor moment here because when you want to have a denial effect or a disruption effect and you're prepared to shell something, that's a much more reliable way to do it than to have things lined up in advance. But I was taken, as Dr. Lawson was, with the speed and deftness with which Ukraine mobilized significant global private support in and through cyberspace, using social media platforms like Twitter and Telegram, assembling a global IT army of Ukraine for offensive cyber and providing them with targets, obtaining Starlink stations from Elon Musk to replace their denied satellite internet, and soliciting and obtaining donations, significant donations in cryptocurrency. Partisans have always played a role in wars, but this ability to mobilize them globally and significantly, I think, is relatively new. The second thing that surprised me shouldn't have been a surprise because Clausewitz rose from the grave and slapped me to remind me that the fog of war hangs over cyberspace too. It's difficult to get an accurate picture of what's happening in cyberspace at the best of times, but now I am reminded that that would be particularly difficult during a shooting war. We have seen a lot of media stories claiming that nothing's happening in cyberspace and speculating on reasons, but I think it's important not to draw broad conclusions on partial data. For example, the story of the Viasat hack was only broken through in open source through a Reuters exclusive on March 11th, although it happened on the 24th of February. Part of this might be because Ukraine's not in a position to be collecting data, and they may have more urgent concerns than a denial of an online resource. And Russia is controlling its internet. A lot of the action that is being tracked by open source media is action that's in English and on Twitter, and that's not necessarily where everything's going on. Going on in Russian, going on in Ukrainian, going on in other platforms like Telegram. So I'm going to wait and see how this story unfolds as we get more data.
Okay, thank you. CJ, Professor Horn?
Hi, just want to make sure you can hear me because my microphone seemed to have a problem a second ago. I think the two panelists already have outlined, I think, the major things. For me, I'm really curious to see and understand why we have not seen more, whether it's a decision to have a certain amount of restraint, whether it was part of a plan where they said, we don't think we need to have this because it's going to be a very quick, decisive victory and we don't want to reveal capabilities. I'm just not sure why it has not happened. But the piece that also strikes me as a little bit unusual that I had not anticipated, to be honest, was this kind of like global call to arms of volunteers to come support Ukraine. And then so the question for me going forward is if we are engaged in some kind of activity going forward as the United States, whether or not we might see that also occur against us, and how would we be prepared to execute against that? So I think those are some questions there that we need to really seriously explore before we draw a lot of conclusions. Over.
Great, thank you. And I'll toss it to Professor Schneider now.
Well, I think at this point, the panel has pretty much covered what really was surprising. Maybe I'll change the question a little bit, and maybe kind of some lessons that I've taken from the first few weeks of war, which maybe not a surprise, but a lesson. The first is how important defense is. We don't know whether the lack of significant cyber attacks is due to restraint or because the Russians tried and couldn't. But there definitely seems to be evidence suggesting that a kind of offensive towards safeguarding digital resources that occurred in the few weeks prior to the actual conventional campaign may have had a big impact. And why does defense matter so much in an offense-dominant environment? Well, it's because offense is actually very manpower intensive. And I think that's another lesson to take from this conflict. When we ask, why isn't Russia conducting more cyber attacks? Why isn't Russia attacking more of Western or US digital resources? I think part of the answer has to be a manpower shortage. I mean, we often think of cybersecurity as a technical domain, and it is, but in reality, finding accesses and developing exploits is extremely manpower intensive. So if you are fighting a conflict and you have a certain amount of cyber exploits and accesses that are sitting on the proverbial shelf, and then you move into battle, battle changes those networks. So they're moving to encrypted communications, their networks are actually changing and they're updating. Industries are patching and responding to threats. And so the accesses and exploits that you go to war with quickly no longer become effective. This is something we've talked about prior to the Ukrainian conflict. But now you have a limited amount of manpower that has to build this inventory again. And I think what it shows is how important having that large manpower resource really is. And I think if there's one lesson I can take from this that I hope the audience takes as well, is that because we didn't get cyber Pearl Harbor does not mean that cyber doesn't matter. The investments that the Ukraine made in a resilient internet, in networks that could adapt when they were hacked, that is an expensive endeavor and something that the United States has not invested heavily in. I'm a reservist, I can't access my email, right? It's not even war. The chances that the United States can adapt as proactively as Ukraine are very low, and that's because we haven't put the resources into it. So I think the United States needs to continue to invest in IT infrastructure and resilient IT infrastructure and manual backups. And they're going to need to continue to invest in a cyber workforce, both for defense and for offense, recognizing that the reality is that you can't stockpile a lot of cyber weapons and expect to be using them in day 30 of the conflict. So sorry, I kind of switched it up a little bit, but the panelists are so smart. They already said all the smart things about what was surprising.
Oh, no, that was perfect. And let me ask a little follow-up to you and maybe some of the other panelists. Why do you think so many people overestimated the potential of the offense in cybersecurity? I've gotten in many arguments with people about this, and they seem so sure that this was an offensive dominant ascendant time period. And I don't know where this came from. So, can you walk us through that issue a little bit, Jackie?
I think we've always had a problem with vocabulary and how we talk about cyber threats. Nobody on this panel is going to say that cyber attacks aren't going to happen. Nobody on this panel is going to say that all infrastructures are invulnerable or all battle networks are invulnerable. Even a poor Russian cyber performance had successes, for example, against satellite linkages, right? And I would venture to say in public that there are going to be cyber attacks on Western infrastructure in the next 30 days. This is not a hard bet for me to make. There's a difference between attacks and long-term effects, and an even bigger difference between attacks and creating physical effects. So I think that maybe where the field got confused was a lot of us looked at cyber operations and said it's really, really difficult to create long-term effects. In fact, my research suggests that one of the largest puzzles about cyber is how little of a big effect they make, but instead how little people want to respond to it is also interesting, right? So these attacks are happening all the time, and yet what I find is that people are generally overconfident in cyber capabilities and underestimate their own vulnerabilities. And what instead we have are these kind of long distance time horizons, where cyber attacks are more like termites that infest your foundation. And the solution is really annoying and remediation, and it's very boring. But people weren't looking for termites, right? They were looking for a bomb that was going to drop on the house instead. But I think maybe we were just talking past each other.
Yeah, what's funny about the future attacks issue is that in some ways, the wisdom of the cyber crowd is so bad and so off that I'm tempted to say there's going to be no cyber attacks, between Russia and the United States in response to economic warfare. But on the other hand, I made it clear that there have been 47 attacks between Russia and the United States between 2000 and 2020.
Most of them came after 2014. We should not be surprised to see a Russian attack. But on the other hand, the fear that the Russians have, and my co-author Ben Jensen said it best on C-SPAN recently, that Putin is fearful of our responses. He won't be within 10 feet of his own people. He's fearful of getting poisoned at this point. So, this idea that the Russians, the gloves are off now, I don't know. The rest of the panel, maybe Sean wants to go first about overinflation of the offense and the perspectives on the offense in cybersecurity.
Yeah. No, that's actually one of the things that I had on my sort of lessons list here, was that we need to think more about the defense and this issue of offense versus defense, but also what you just alluded to, which is that we have to really assess our own assumptions and assessments. So to date, I see a lot of discussion about why cyber has not played out the way we had expected that it would. Like, why aren't the Russians doing what we think they should be doing, or what we thought they would do, what we expected they would do? But I think we really need to dig in more deeply into the question of why we seem to have gotten it wrong. Why did we expect that the Russians would do that? Right? Where do our expectations come from, and why did we get it wrong? Which is a subtle difference, right? And so, I actually, can point to some things from my 2020 book that I talk about in that regard, in terms of the language and the sort of patterns of thinking that we have tended to use in the United States. I think the first problem here is what I call in the book projection, or I think in the Intel community might be called mirror imaging, right? Which is that we often expect others to do what we would do, right? We expect others to use cyber the way that we have thought about using cyber, and that this way of thinking about using cyber is deeply rooted in our own history and culture, including, longstanding fears of technological determinism and technology getting out of control, assumptions about the essential role of communications infrastructure in the formation and maintenance of societies, but also more recent ideas about information, communication, and decision-making being, the sort of keys to success in warfare, right? So we can think back to, the days of John Boyd and the OODA loop, or John Warden and the 5 rings, and the idea that information and communication and command and control are really the keys to success on our side, and the keys to, striking the adversary effectively. And so I think a lot of those assumptions are still playing into our thinking about what we think others will be thinking about and will do when it comes to cyber. But there's other issues as well. So another issue I talk about is what I call possibilistic thinking. So we confuse often the possible with the probable. And so a subvariant of that is sort of confusing vulnerabilities and threats. So it's a sort of deterministic way of thinking where we have a tendency to say, oh, if a vulnerability exists, then it's only a matter of time. It's inevitable that the vulnerability will be exploited, and therefore a vulnerability is almost tantamount, to being a threat, which is not always the case, right? And then with the cyber Pearl Harbor kind of stuff, I think that's reflective of a tendency towards worst case thinking, worst case scenario kind of mentality, which I think has also led us astray in some respects. And then finally, in terms of the cyber wisdom of the crowd that Brandon alluded to, oftentimes one of the things that I've noticed in my research and that I've written about in the past is we often tend to draw from a very limited pool of cyber expertise in our public discourse. And that is often industry folks, technology folks, and, former government officials and whatnot. There's a lot of really good work that's been done in among academics and among folks from PME that doesn't get enough attention and enough play in the broader public discourse. People like Jackie and Brandon and Erica, who's not on the call today, and others, and Ben Jensen that Brandon mentioned, right, have done excellent work in this regard. And if we really pay attention to the research they've done, we shouldn't be as surprised with the way things have played out. But too often our public discourse is shaped by, folks who are primarily coming from the private sort of technology space and and other areas of expertise that maybe don't give them as much knowledge on thinking about cyber in the context of everything else, in the context of global conflict, international relations, and warfare, as as we might expect.
Thanks. Professor Thomas, you've written about physical effects, particularly at a War on the Rocks recently, which I welcome you to post in the chat. I don't have it handy anymore. But did you want to offer any thoughts on physical effects, offensive cyber warfare, and the lack of physical effects in Ukraine, possibly? I mean, besides the VSAT issue.
So actually, I have a more recent article that's probably more on point. It just came out in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. It's called Distinguishing Cyber Attacks by Difficulty. One of the things that I see as a sometimes shortcoming in our strategic discussion about cyber is the failure to distinguish between different types of cyber attacks, how hard they are to actually put together, and how likely they are to succeed. So the one that we normally talk about is a cyber attack on critical infrastructure that has long-term physical effects. That's actually, I would argue, difficult to put together. It's beyond the reach of most people to do that. And the reason isn't because the cyber is hard, it's because the intel is hard. And so often I think those complementary abilities that a state brings to bear, like intelligence capabilities, may be a better marker of what makes a cyber attack hard than the actual technical skills. In the context of Ukraine, President Putin didn't expect this to be a very short war. It sort of switched over to a siege base at a later point. We are getting some reports. There was another significant attack on Ukrainian telecom, but Ukraine also had an enormous amount of external support in the form of technical companies, in the form of allied partners to defend and to provide intelligence and to help them fend off cyber attacks. And there are some early reports that the volume of attacks went up significantly. What it looks like is that those just weren't successful, including the volume of attacks against, for example, the Ukrainian electrical grid. So I think we'll have to wait and see whether this was a case of the defense responding sufficiently strongly to offense, or whether this was simply not a strong priority for Russia, given that it was willing to go kinetic.
Great, thanks. I'll toss it to you, the next question in a second, CJ, and you can work in any offensive comments. Any comments on the cyber offense at that point? It's fascinating to talk to this panel, and I can talk for hours, surprisingly, because a lot of people know I have problems with the cybersecurity field. And I also saw Scott Jasper in the audience, and I want to remind people that he has a great book on Russian cyber operations, which I guess you can chime in when we're done with the panel questions, Scott. But you're going to have to update that book now, man. That's a rough one. So let me go first to CJ, but the general tendency, I think, in the United States is to extrapolate a lot from an international incident. Particularly, we've seen this with Stuxnet and even the Sony hack back in the day. And these incidents have been transformative in some ways for U.S. cyber strategy. The timing of this war is remarkable because I know on Friday I'm going to go get a teaser of the U.S. DoD cyber defense strategy. So what lessons do you think we need to take away from this conflict for U.S. strategy? What do we need to do? What do we need to do differently now, given what's happened? And let me kick it to Professor Horn first.
Well, I want to build off my comments from the other panelists and Melissa. I think we ought to be very cautious about drawing conclusions right now. What you see in the public domain is articulating what is readily available, but I have a feeling there is a lot more going on behind the scenes at the classified level that we're just not quite aware of publicly yet. So I think we ought to be just very cautious about saying, okay, this is what has happened that we know of, and then try to figure out why. I'm always reminded, as my training as a historian, about what we learned when the wall came down and the Cold War historians got to go through the Soviet archives. And we found out that a lot of times what we attributed to be Soviet actions or inactions, we got totally wrong. And we would claim it to be one thing and it turned out to be something else. So I think we may be in a similar boat here, that we're speculating about why we haven't seen more cyber activities from Russia. And it could be that, hey, this is all they have to offer. It could be that there's a lot of restraint that's going on. It could be that they were focused on one set of targets and suddenly told, go do something else. I honestly don't know. But what I will offer up is that I think the United States is a little bit different from Ukraine in terms of the interconnectedness of its society, especially its economic and how we do governance, compared to Ukraine. And so the mere scale of what we face as a society is significantly different from what Ukraine faces. So I hope we'll be cautious in the conclusions that we draw from. As for other aspects of cyber strategy, I would offer up that I am very concerned as we go forward that we might say, hey, this isn't a big deal, so therefore we can continue to go down the path that we continue to do. And for example, I look at how the military has been approaching future conflict as saying we should expect to be in an EMS degraded, if not outright denied environment. And yet I look at our acquisition strategy and I see that our sixth generation fighter is going to become even more networked, not less. And that we're pushing even national security systems to be onto the cloud because this is a more secure or more efficient way of doing things. So I think we may have some incongruence in terms of what we're thinking, what the future warfight could be versus what we were trying to do. And then we're using this Ukraine-Russia as an example to support one approach versus the other. So I think those are just my initial thoughts as relates to that. Over.
Great, thank you. Sean, do you have any thoughts on U.S. cyber strategy and lessons that we might want to or not learn from this recent conflict?
Yeah. So, getting back to the sort of defense, part of it. I think, even when we have talked about defense, we tend to talk about it in a very sort of, I don't know, action or offense oriented kind of defense, right? So the terms we tended to use are like active defense. We're defending forward. We're persistently engaging, right? But part of what we noticed, in the last month when things really got real is that, we have CISA and we have the president telling businesses and critical infrastructures, to lock their cyber doors, to raise their shields, and to do all of it like yesterday, right? But I think like this should have been the case all along, right? Just because a determined burglar is probably going to get into your house, no matter, your security system, it doesn't mean that you don't lock your doors and close the windows when you leave, just as a regular matter of course, right? And so I think we need to think about that. We need to think about the kind of resilience plans that we can put in place, that Jackie was talking about and that Professor Horn was just talking about, and thinking in advance of like, what are we going to do in terms of operating in a degraded sort of cyber environment? To me, I sort of put that under the broad umbrella of like defense or resilience, right? I think there's a lesson here in that regard. And I like your analogy, Brandon, to, the Ukrainians pulling out like World War I era, like field telephones or whatever, right? Like we need to think about what kind of like innovative or, tricksy kinds of things that we can do to be more resilient in that kind of an environment. I think we also have to think more about what happens in the future. I think somebody already alluded to this, like when we end up in a fight where, we have lots of third parties involved, and like, what does that do to our strategy? We tend to talk about cyber as a state on state or state aligned, at least kind of activity. But the reemergence of groups like Anonymous, the rapid mobilization of the IT army, et cetera, means that I think we have to think a lot more seriously about what cyber strategy should look like in such a chaotic setting, and essentially what is a cyber melee or cyber bar fight. And then finally, there is ongoing work in this area, but I think we need to continue thinking about the integration of cyber and information operations. So IO is increasingly important in these kinds of fights. And cyber is an important enabler of IO, as we're finding out, and that includes, hacking and leaking information for effect, or using DDoS as a sort of, cyber jamming of enemy, internet communications with its citizens, or defacements and intrusions that replace website or television content. I think of as sort of akin to like, that C-130 flying over, adversary territory, and, replacing enemy broadcast signals with our own messages to the population or whatnot. Or we've even seen an increasing use of individual targeting of adversary soldiers and civilians with IO messaging during the conflict. So I think we have to think more about cyber-enabled IO, and not only how we might use that against others, but how that might be used against us in these kinds of future conflicts.
Great, thanks. And the point about World War I era technology was really came from a political article before the war that kind of highlighted the coming potential of technologies used during this war. But I took their reporting on how wired, ancient wiring and cable technology was being used on the front lines and in the trenches as a sign of what might be to come. Then probably would should have taken the whole issue of the Russians selling their gas in Belarus as another sign of what was to come. But that's the only point. I'll post the article in the chat. Let me kick it to Professor Thomas, and then we'll end with Jackie again on this round on U.S. cyber strategy, because I know she has a lot of thoughts on that issue.
Thank you. I think that Dr. Lawson hit my main point already, which is the importance of building redundant and resilient systems. The problem is, this is like buying insurance, right? Nobody wants to spend for insurance, but you really need it when you need it. So I would like to see us start with thinking carefully about secure design on the one hand, and avoiding over-reliance on single contractors. That's really a message that I took away from the Viasat hack. We really can't afford to be penny wise and pound foolish. That's pretty much my main recommendation for the cyber strategy. We do have to think about third-party actors, and that was actually, I was going to circle back for that for lessons on PME, but I'm sure that we'll hit that when we get there. Over.
Great, thank you. And Jackie, do you want to unleash your thoughts on the coming U.S. cyber strategy?
Sure. It's funny, I had a whole thread yesterday about the coming US cyber strategy, and like 10 people cared, which I thought was a really interesting sign that
I cared.
I know, but I think this is increasingly becoming extremely wonky. I mean, it was always a wonky little world, and like now that cyber is not Pearl Harbor, everyone's like, oh yeah, not super interested. Though everybody on this panel obviously is. So a few ideas, things. First off, on this discussion about resiliency, I think resiliency needs to be one of the pillars of the future cyber strategy. That would be actually an addition, right? This is not something we've seen significantly in the strategy before. And generally, when defense or resiliency gets discussed within strategy, it's almost a throwaway point. So I've been an officer that has to implement strategic lines of effort, and we've always been light on implementation and measures of effectiveness when we think about defense and resiliency. Part of the problem is that most of the solutions when it comes to defense and resiliency do not live in the cyber stovepipe. They live in the operational community, and they live in the services who are making decisions about ABMS and overmatch, and I don't even know what the Marines are calling their version of network, but all these versions of networks that come under JADC2, and the cyber command has no say over that. DISA has actually limited say over service-related network decisions as well. So, on one hand, we're going to say we need resiliency to be a huge part of the cyber strategy, and on the other hand, there is very limited incentives on the service side. And I think what my colleagues are saying here about centralization, the use of single source cloud computing, single source vulnerabilities for software and IT, all of these things are not, this is not how the commercial world works. The commercial world works in hybrid computing, in backups, in multiple vendors, and the United States DoD does none of those things. In fact, they've moved towards more centralization and less resiliency. So you're going to have to align things like Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks's IT modernization strategy with the cyber strategy. And in the past, these things have been almost completely disconnected. In fact, it's actually like a very different group of people that are in these two different worlds. So resiliency, I think the other kind of forward progress we can make in cyber strategy is actually thinking about measures of effectiveness. Now, I know the Marines in the room, you know, there are different doctrinal terms for measures of effectiveness and measures of performance. And we have never really figured out measures of effectiveness for cyber strategy. So how do we know when it's working, when it's not working? How do we assess whether task forces are more or less effective, or if they should be stood down? That stuff's always really been a hand wave inside the strategy. And then finally, I just want to iterate, I think, how important counter cyber operations continue to be. This is what is called in the previous strategy defend forward. I think we use very unclear language, but I think that can continue to be a part of U.S. defense cyber strategy because it's a role that nobody else in the U.S. federal government can take. So I think that is a unique place that if there's anyone here who is working for the DASI and they're making decisions about whether to keep counter cyber operations, I'm a vote for yes. I also think deterrence plays a role, but at the very strategic level. So none of these things, it used to be that these were presented as completely contradictory concepts, but I actually think they're all lines of effort within a larger strategy.
So, Jackie, when you get the strategy, probably next week, you know, like all academics, we go to the back of articles and look at the footnotes. What are you going to look for right away when you get the cyber strategy? I know for me, it's going to be persistent engagement and imposed costs.
Oh, well, persistent engagement was always a cyber command buzzword, not a OSD buzzword. So I don't think we'll see persistent engagement show up inside a cyber strategy. And then also, I mean, I'm a little unclear. The NSS has not been released, so it seems like it should go NSS NDS cyber strategy. We'll see. So you might see a version of the cyber strategy sitting on the West Coast has not, and I think it probably won't be publicly released until after the NSS and the NDS, or that's what I would recommend for those who are making those decisions. So yeah, I mean, what do I think will be in there? I think they will talk a lot more about resiliency. That's showed up in the summary for the NDS. I think integrated deterrence is going to have a cameo appearance. And they're going to have to like figure out what integrated deterrence is. And then I think defend forward will still be in there, but I think it'll be called something else. And I think that will actually be an advancement for the strategy.
Okay, thanks. CJ, do you have any additional thoughts about what you're going to look for in the cyber strategy?
So in this case, I'm assuming we're talking the DoD cyber strategy. And what I really want to say is really related to the national cyber strategy piece. And I think the country has to start making a decision about how it wants to organize itself for operations in this domain. Because what we're seeing in the past 5 years of NDAAs is that we keep on turning to US Cybercom to start doing more and more actions in this space, which are not what I'd say modern traditional military actions in terms of election security, now doing some infrastructure related security under presidential direction, going after non-state affiliated criminal groups potentially when they do something. We're seeing this expansion. And if you look at the current NDAA, now Cybercom is starting to develop some pilots for partnerships directly with the private sector and to do coordinated activities with them, letting them know when we're doing some kind of defensive operation and the like. So this government looks like we're leaning towards Cybercom because it's the 800-pound gorilla in terms of external capability. And I think we still need to have that discussion about whether or not we want a U.S. military organization taking on these roles, or should we start looking at how our other federal executive our executive branch agencies should be playing a larger part and resourcing them for that. I don't think we've had that thorough discussion going on, because we go where Chris Demchek has said years ago, we go where the cyber capability is, and that's the main player in all aspects of national security. So that piece has to be still discussed, and then really what does that mean for military if cybercom is doing all these other activities over.
I think quickly,
Jackie, you had another point?
yeah, I really wanted to finger here because I think this is extremely, extremely important. What is the lesson we learned from Ukraine? That manpower is the biggest resource limitation for cyber operations. If Cyber Command is doing all these various different tasks, there is no way in God's green earth that there is enough cyber talent inside the Department of Defense to also conduct all the operational planning and development of capabilities for campaigns. It is impossible. And if you look at how large the Cyber National Mission Force is, and this is a distinction, right? The Cyber National Mission Force is a joint organization which is run by Cyber Command that is focused on defending the nation, as opposed to the service elements that are assigned to, the Air Force, the Marines, and then assigned to different combatant commands. That's a really, really small group of people. And we do not have the resources to spend all of our defense capability on defending private critical infrastructure. Not to mention, I think there are some really important legal obligations here. And to be honest, we don't have the ability to stand up large amounts of manpower in this space inside the DoD within military personnel. We have not been able to build the training that is comparable to the civilian side. And we also have real trouble with recruitment and retention. So the DoD needs to get honest about what it can and can't do. And it needs to stop trying to bite out to take as many missions as possible, especially the missions that they think are cool, in order to continue to stay relevant. They need to focus on where the DoD has a unique mission set. And I do think that prioritization has always been missing from the strategy. And that's actually where DASD plays a very important role in dictating the allocation of cyber resources, which is, I think, honestly, part of why the DASD office and OSD and Cyber Command often butt heads.
Very true. And I am scared to ask you about space policy. But we also have a question about the National Guard State Partnership Program that I'll probably kick to you once we do the PME question. But of course, we represent PMEs here. Professional military education. A lot of us are deeply engaged in this process. I'll let Jackie end the PME question, because I know she maybe have a lot of problems with some of the PME structures that we have. But this is an important moment for us in PME education in terms of cybersecurity. And there has been a lot of challenges. The NDU CKIC program was basically, almost cut off at one point over the last few years. And now the Air Force Cyber College is going through a number of challenges. NPS is okay, but they're not exactly organized in a central manner. The Marine Corps in the same way. So what does the PME community need to do to respond to the events of the war? How are we going to organize and respond to the challenges introduced by cyber behavior in the real world? And what should our role be? What should our responsibility be? I'll kick this to CJ Horn first, and then we'll go Sean, Melissa, and then Jackie. I also have a War on the Rocks article that I wrote with Erica Longren, who was going to talk about the article, but she's no longer here. But I'll post that in the chat. But I know a lot of us have a lot of opinions about cyber education in the PME community. So, Carl?
Well, I'm one of those critics about PME, and it's not because the people who do PME aren't trying to do all the right things. It's just because they're asked to do an awful lot in a very short period of time, with limited space in a curriculum. So it becomes very crowded. I think one of the major problems that we have going forward is that the public account. It's going to be very, very hard to talk about aspects of this conflict, because everything that we do is at the classified level. The policy strategies are written at least at the secret level. The operations, campaign plans, and the like are usually at the TS level. It becomes very hard to explain to students what is going on and why when you have to do it in an unclassified form, which is what almost all the PME institutions have to do. Not only because of the size of their classes, but also because you have international officers who are part of it, which is a very important part, but you can't have this classified stuff with this unclassified, essentially, audience. You can teach fundamentals at the unclassified level, but as a student of mine years ago he used an artist analogy, which I think is useful. You can teach them painting techniques at the unclassified level, but the palette that you actually paint with is at the TS level. And would you want your portrait being painted by someone who only knew techniques and never knew what the palettes were to actually paint with? And I think that's the biggest problems that we have going on today. And I think that's what you're going to see as you try to draw lessons from this conflict and put it into our PME programs, is that we're just not going to be able to discuss it until we change how we do classifications and the releasing of information. So I'll just leave it at that because I know we're getting short on time. Over.
Oh, we can go as almost as long as we want to, as long as the questions are interesting and as long as childcare allows. And I would push back greatly on this because I have large concerns about classification and PME education. And I think Professor Hathaway also just did a podcast or article on this issue recently that I've been meaning to look at. But I think one of the key concerns is that we often think that the good techniques or the good palettes or the good colors are in the classified sector. And the longer I've been in this world, the more I figure that they're not. And that when we move considerations or issues to the classified sector, it's often because people just want to hide things. And maybe that's too much of my experience with the Solarium Commission, but that's been my experience so far. But I'll kick it to Dr. Lawson. As also kind of as an outsider, but who is deeply engaged in military strategy and technology, what are your views on PME education and cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm clearly not in PME on a daily basis. I mostly teach, like civilian 20-year-olds at a at a state university, so it's a very different kind of an environment. Not a lot of issues with classification in that world, but based on my sort of research, primarily for my first book that looked at the role of ideas being imported from the natural sciences into military strategy formation, and doing a lot of work on, the historical sort of development of like air-land battle and maneuver warfare and stuff in the Army and the Marine Corps in the 70s and 80s. I mean, I know that PME can play a really important role in doctrinal innovation, in the development of strategy and the development of creativity and new ideas, right? And so, to me, I think that's where PME has an important role to play in addressing the bigger questions and the underlying assumptions that we all sort of talked about earlier in the discussion. And that PME ideally should provide the space and time for officers to step back and really reflect on these bigger issues, to think creatively about where we're at and where we might be going with cyber in the future. And that PME's engagement with cyber, shouldn't just merely be sort of indoctrinating folks with the current way of thinking, that, student projects and the thesis paper that a lot of folks write when they go through these programs should not merely regurgitate sort of the current state of things or the accepted line, but rather that PME should really provide the opportunity for future leaders to step back, to dig deep into the subject, to challenge those existing assumptions, and to begin to fill the gaps in our current thinking. And that, that's an important role for PME.
That's a great point. Often we don't push the edges, and that's a function of PME education that I think people don't understand sometimes, is that a lot of the courses we have are canned and replicated and repeated, and it's tough to push the edges, but we need to do that. Professor Thomas, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Well, I would say that there's some issues generally with incorporating cyber effectively into PME that have to do with the industrial structure of PME. That's probably outside of the scope of our current conversation, which is focused specifically on this conflict and what the lessons that we can take away from it. So So I'll turn my comments there. I would say that when we discuss cyberspace in conflict in PME, we're going to have to pay more attention to the role of private actors and third parties. I think Dr. Lawson flagged this earlier. We have a tendency to talk about this as a state-on-state conflict and ignore private parties. I think that the role of private parties can only grow. I would add that for exercises, we do some training and have some exercises where we imagine, for example, a comms-denied environment. But nobody wants to have an exercise that lasts for 5 minutes. So if there's a scenario that sort of puts an end to things, we don't do that scenario because people don't want to say, thank you so much for coming. Look forward to seeing you next year. So perhaps in exercises, we need to imagine that we will be having multiple repetitions of the exercise in the exercise space, allowing for comms-denied environments or sweeping systems failures. That's sort of what I would take away from this. But more broadly, the challenge for cyber and PME is that it does require some technical knowledge and technical expertise that is not going to be shared across the entire faculty, and that is difficult in terms of delivering this as a core course to multiple seminars. Over.
Great, thank you. So, Professor Schneider, as a former professor in the PME community and someone who's actually taken PME courses, can we get your views on cyber education in the PME system?
So I think one of the largest challenges, and for context, I worked at the Naval War College. And so the Naval War College is focused on really 04 to 06 time period. And it's a real focus on strategy. This is different than like MPS or AFIT, for example, which is a focus on creating technical graduate level skills. That's where I think the biggest controversy has been is the technical versus the strategic, and what different institutions should be focusing on. At the Naval War College, we quickly realized that technical was never going to be our forte, and that instead, in order to incorporate cyber operations into the curriculum, you needed to focus on strategy. Now that actually, I don't work there anymore, so who knows where they came down, but it kind of turned into, oh, I guess we'll do like a half-day workshop at the beginning of the semester. And that was how they integrated, because the Navy is not going to cut Mahan in order to talk about cyber. Like, this is not going to happen. But I think, as somebody who is an officer and who has taught at PME, especially for the 04 to 06 range grade, you want to give people, what you want to do is you want to create officers that can make decisions in the face of uncertainty. So if PME is focusing too much on the technical, that's really time sensitive, and the technical changes quite a bit. And most of my officers are not going to need to be on the keyboard. Instead, they are officers that are coming from other specialties that need to be able to think about how they incorporate and respond to cyber threats. And so I actually think that there's a very low knowledge that you need to get to be able to make educated decisions about cyber in other domains. And I think we can get there, but I do think that most of PME should be focusing on this strategic and high operational level when it comes to cyber operations. And I guess I would disagree quite a bit with the idea that we need to only be teaching classified, because the classified world and the capabilities that are resident in the classified world are not fixed. They change very quickly. And so I think if we're focusing solely on kind of what is the current order of battle and the current capabilities, I mean, I could send people to a Stanford hacking class and they could learn a whole lot more about cyber than they probably could learn from sitting through a DoD cyber classified order of battle lesson. So I think that really PME should be focusing on the strategic. I think we should continue to offer officers the opportunity to sit in and to take classes like the one that Alex Stamos runs at Stanford, which is, an introduction to hacking. I mean, it's better than that, but I think that core competency is not inside the DoD and not inside PME, unless you're like AFIT or MPS, and we could argue whether they're actually PME or not.
Okay, thank you. So let's see, a few points of order. I think we may go to a half hour after the hour, maybe 30 more minutes. I don't know if we have enough questions for that, but I have 2 questions loaded. I'm going to toss it back to CJ right now. But before that, I wanted to highlight for Major Brown that if we can let Dan ask a question, I would like to hear more about the think tank idea, because I'm a little bit dubious of the think tank perspective in the PME world, given that I actually work at a think tank now. And I think some of the concern that someone like me might have, or someone may have, is like the Army Cyber Institute, which Erica represents, and SciPi out of Naval Postgrad School, Naval War College, doesn't exactly do education in the way that we think that most people do education. So there are cyber think tanks in the PME community, but they're not actually connected to the PME community in terms of having clear class duties. And I didn't have clear class tasks when I worked with the Marine Corps for 5 years. So I would like to hear more from Dan on that issue, and maybe thinking a little bit more on how we encourage military leaders to think about innovation in a manageable way moving forward. But CJ, you wanted to add some more points on this issue?
I just want to clarify my thing about the classified instruction is that right now, the way things are configured, you cannot really convey to our students in PME what is going on in cyberspace on a purely unclassified environment. Heck, I can't even talk the strategy piece because the summaries of the strategies are so vague and insufficient. Melissa and I taught this year an unclassified year-long elective at Air War College, and the students were very eager to learn, but they would ask a lot of questions that we just can simply not address in an unclassified forum, to the point of where I would offer up many students think the United States does almost nothing in cyberspace because all you ever hear is about how the United States is a victim of attacks or incidents that are going on all the time. And the answer is, well, what are we doing to respond? And you have only these public statements and some of these things that are going on unclassified that you go, okay, what does that actually mean? So in order for me to teach strategy and how you might integrate cyber at a strategic level, I have to get into something more than just the unclassified stuff. So there has to be a better balance, either declassifying things so we can go forward and bring this in, or having more opportunities to teach classified, which are very limited throughout all of PME. And to be honest, I think CIC at NDU is the only one that has something where a good portion of its curriculum can be taught at classified, although this past 2 years with COVID, that has been relatively limited also. So I'm not saying that you have to teach everything, but you got to have something. And right now, we don't have the right balance at all. So your graduates coming out of PME in general are going to learn about this at their next jobs when they have the access to the materials as they go forward. And I like to see them going out there back into the force already have a better understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I will just say, we're doing a lot of stuff, a lot of good stuff, which I think are having positive impacts in the world. I just can't talk about it. So it's really hard being in this institution and not being able to at least tell our own students what we're doing. Over.
I mean, I agree with you to a large extent, but then on the other hand, this is also a function of who you are. And there's a difference between like someone like me who's avoided clearance this entire time, because it allows me to talk about these issues and engage these issues and talk about what the U.S. has done. But recently, we've updated our dyadic cyber data set with the Army, and we've been done for 6 months, and we're trying to get it cleared. And we barely talk about U.S. cyber operations. And in fact, to this point, I think my data is biased against U.S. cyber operations. So I think this is a function of how we behave, and that there is a utility, like Jackie says, that she can teach this in a civilian space and not have problems. And that's been the MPS model, because the MPS model of cyber education is to teach to international partners and not to teach in a classified space. So in some ways, we kind of hurt ourselves by how we organize and structure this community, which is why I wanted to read that Hathaway piece. But let's jump to, I have 2 questions loaded right now. Both basically for Jackie, kind of in some ways. One was asking about the National Guard State Partnership Program and what influence that might have had on the war in Ukraine. And I know you wrote for the Solarium a bit on the National Guard, if I remember correctly. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And, what do you think about the National Guard and reserves and how we should organize for cyber and how they can help states like Ukraine? We'll go to
Yes,
Jackie and then anyone else who wants to chime.
the National Guard partnership is a really interesting project. So I first heard about the National Guard state partnership project 3 or 4 years ago, and I was at Cyber Command. We have Guard and Reserve liaisons, and I was talking to the head Guard liaison, and he was telling me about. He showed me this map of all these different Guard units that were going to all these different foreign countries and training with them and working with them, and I thought, what a waste. It's like, this is not what the Guard is for. The Guard is for domestic response. The Guard has really unique authorities, especially in cyberspace, that means that it doesn't have time to work with Ukraine. This is absurd. So this was my impression at the time, and then I kind of didn't hear about it. But the person who was running the program, I was actually shocked at how big the program was and how mature the program was. Then this conflict kicks off, and the close relationship that the California Guard had with Ukraine and how that relationship had affected training and readiness in Ukraine, and then the ability for the California Guard to be able to have these informal connections with members of the Ukrainian military that was really impossible without this kind of long-term relationship between that state guard and Ukraine. I was wrong. It was absolutely wrong. Now, I don't know how much involvement the California Cyber Guard had. I mean, I'm just talking from there's a Wall Street Journal article and a Task and Purpose article that's talking about the California Guard. But I was wrong. And I think this actually was a really great opportunity. Something I did not understand about how the Guard and the flexibility that the Guard has with how it allocates its resources could actually be a real asset for security assistance. Didn't think about it. Now, I think most people in this room are going to understand there is a very big difference between the Guard and the Reserve. The Guard operates on different authorities. It has a different chain of command. The Reserves really is the active duty, but sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time. And so the Reserves are more of an augmentation for the active duty, even though I would prefer the Reserves to be more like a flexible alternative to the active duty, but it really gets treated more as an augmentation. And so the Reserves is not allowed, for example, to deal with if the California Secretary of State has a cybersecurity issue, it can use the California Guard under California Guard authorities to help with cybersecurity. You cannot use reservists for that because reservists don't operate under the same authority. So there is a difference. I actually think the Reserves can help a lot on the manpower issue that we talked about earlier. The Guard can as well, but I think the Guard should be primarily focused on state issues.
Great, thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to chime in on Guard, Reserves, and collaboration for defense in Ukraine? No. Okay, Dan said that he doesn't have a mic, but he clarified his question a little bit, or he clarified his point a little bit. And I vigorously agree that if we can have many different points of view come together and share different ideas and perspectives and pick them apart as a problem set in the PME community, that's great. And that's exactly what the Krulak community does. Major Brown, are you there? Do you want to talk about some of the future war programs you have going on at the Krulak and how you gather different PME entities together to kind of create a think tank at the Krulak community?
Yeah, sure. Wasn't planning on hitting that, but I think this, we can start off by what we're doing right here as an example of bringing those threads together, doing digital outreach and then using that to kind of build a repository of knowledge that's accessible both in real time with people asking you questions, and then later on in a digital library like we have on our YouTube and podcast channels. That is one part of it, so that our these discussions can live on and be accessed afterwards. But other things we have done is using this sort of same network to help enhance the curricula here, enhance some of the scholars programs we offer. In fact, I'll lead. I'll do a little spoiler alert for what I was going to clean up here, but next Friday morning, we're going to have a broadcast that not so much on cyber per se, but it's using one of our non-resident fellows that we built up through our network and a student research project that started over a year ago when the student was at EWS. And they've been presenting at several academic symposiums, to include a recent one at Strategic Command, looking at how linguistics impact perception, or how linguistic analysis can impact or tell us prevailing trends on how U.S. true presence is perceived in partners, neutral countries, and adversaries. But we also do things like, try and bring some of these concepts into the war games that we host on a regular basis. For anyone out there who's been following War on the Rocks of late, Colonel Barrick, our wargaming director, just posted a summary of something that he and some of the War College students here had done recently, actually not recently, right before the war in Ukraine kicked off, using wargaming to examine future war. And then the war came, and they looked at things that they think they got sort of right and things that they got wrong. A lot of other things that we do here, writing contests to standalone events like this. So that's sort of the flavor of things that we've done to try and build ourselves up into a think tank. And it's worth noting that we can't do it without the networking that we've done with folks like all of you here on the panel, as well as Dr. Valeriano, who I mentioned, kind of help us stand up this digital professional outreach in a lot of ways. So did that kind of get after it?
Oh, yeah. And I do want to highlight that I think the next session that we may do, or one of the next sessions, will be a joint one with NPS and the Air Force that I'm kind of working on in the background on IO and the experience in cyber, or now we're calling it OIE. I got to get this right, but I think it's now OIE, and we are no longer allowed to call it IO. But I'm hoping to do that fairly soon. We're gonna end on Sergeant Whelan's question, and we'll get to that in a second. But first, the defend forward of it all. Someone asked a question about that earlier, and partnerships and enabling the defense through defend forward. And as my friend JD Work said, I think he was a bit surprised that Erica and I wrote an article that I posted in the chat in National Interest about the defend forward aspect of cyber strategy. And it's an interesting story, given what we did in the Solarium Commission. And it's kind of like one way I can articulate the Solarium experience that I have is like how I came to love defend forward. And I'm going to kick it to Jackie first, because I think she was on that front before I was. But to realize the antagonism between PE and defend forward in some ways, and the tensions between the two, and to get to know the people who wrote these strategies really demonstrated that they were vastly different. And I'm not so sure the PME community understands the differences and the uniquenesses between the two sides and how one is a reaction to the other. So, Jackie, do you want to highlight or kind of explain more about the defend forward of it all in this war, and the positives that we can gain from current cyber strategy in the United States?
Yeah, so I think first off, you bring up a really important point about the difference between defend forward and persistent engagement. And everyone should understand this. Persistent engagement was a concept put forth in the Cyber Command strategic vision. This came out kind of at the end of 2017, so it preceded the defense cyber strategy. It also preceded the NDS and the NSS, so it led. Persistent engagement was really a bureaucratic response to the elevation of Cyber Command from a sub-unified command under Stratcom to a unified command in its own right. And what was happening was, as a sub-unified command and under the Obama administration, the Cyber Command really felt like cyber was being kind of put to the side, and the focus was on deterrence and crisis management. That then had to shift. They wanted their own identity outside of Strategic Command, and a lot of the deterrence rhetoric really filtered down because Strategic Command was in charge of Cyber Command. shaped a lot of the early identity of Cyber Command. So persistent engagement is General Nakasone and his staff coming in and saying, like, there's something different, and we're going to make an argument that Cyber Command is not this rare thing that needs to be saved just for deterrence and crisis management, but instead that we are constantly evolving and constantly having to deal with cyber operations. And they make a few assertions about how cyber operations are not inherently escalatory, and that there are adversaries who are going to be conducting these operations all the time. So what is persistent engagement is really unclear for those of you who have read the vision. It's like, it's actually, I mean, I'm an academic. It's like hard to read. It's really difficult language. And to be honest, strategy should not be difficult. It should be clear and concise, and that's not what it was. But think of persistent engagement as a motto, like just do it. That's really what persistent engagement was. Right now, Defend Forward is coming from a different bureaucratic place. Defend Forward is coming from the Office of Secretary of Defense, DASD office, who is writing the cyber defense policy. And what they did is they actually, they're drafting this, and I'm going to toot my own horn. I'm going to do it. Okay, so we ran this big war game at the Naval War College on critical infrastructure sectors. And we brought in 14 different critical infrastructure sectors, a lot of private industry. And the goal of the game series was to understand at what point and what point they wanted to call in the DoD and what they wanted the DoD for. And over again, the private industry was like, we do not want you doing defense for us. We do not want you in our networks. We want you to start doing something. Please make it harder for them to conduct these attacks. Please attack Russia, China, North Korea, their cyber capabilities, so that it makes it easier for us on our day-to-day, because we have no hackback authority. Please do this for us. And so we reported those results back to the DASD office, and they said, really? So then they went and had their own private engagements with industry and realized, actually, this is something they're really interested in. And so that was a small part of what led to Defend Forward, because they were thinking, hey, we need to be able to use the Department of Defense's authorities and capabilities to attack the Russian, Chinese, North Korean, Iranian cyber forces prior to conflict. Now, Defend Forward, I don't think was what it was initially called. I think it actually had a clearer name initially. But for any of those who have worked on cyber, on any strategy, know that in today's day and age, strategy is not like this beautiful kind of thing that is written on a typewriter by 5 people. Instead, it's a series of messy track changes. And so what strategy ends up being a bunch of bureaucratic compromises that have been like passive aggressively typed over each other for many, many different iterations. And that's what Defend Forward ended up being. So it was the name is a compromise. I think Defend Forward, and if you look at like how OSD talked about Defend Forward versus Nakasone versus like everybody else, there were like 2 years there where no one knew what Defend Forward was. And to be honest, if you walked into Cyber Command, you asked the 8th floor versus the 3rd floor versus the 5th floor what Defend Forward was, nobody could say. Right? Like everyone had different interpretations of what this really meant. I no longer work in that world, but I think the ideas, at least in the public sphere, seems to have coalesced. And Defend Forward is, the counter cyber operations, both defense and offense, that decrease the adversary's ability to conduct cyber operations against you. So it's not attacking critical infrastructure. It's not even attacking IADS. That's a whole different thing. It is attacking the Russian networks that they're using to conduct cyber activities in the first place. And I think if we can say that clearly, then it deserves its place in the next strategy. Long-winded response. Sorry.
That was amazing. I hope future grad students trying to articulate what Defend Forward was and PE was can go back to that diatribe and learn some very important things, because yeah, it was very interesting to get to know the person who wrote Defend Forward and just to understand their struggles, and also to hear from the PE people. And I mean, something we really pushed them on in the Solarium, which I think some people actually thought that the Solarium was meant to ratify PE. And we didn't take that as our mission. We took as our mission to evaluate US cyber strategy, not to validate what was already there. And the big concern that many of us had with PE is that as a strategy, it didn't have an end state. And a strategy needs to have a means, ways, and ends. And if your strategy doesn't have an end state, it's not really a strategy. But I don't want to speak too long on these issues. Carl, Sean, Melissa, do you have any two-finger comments on defend forward in the future?
I know that our current position in DoD is that we do not require third-party country permission to transit their networks in any of these operations. That's something that I'll be paying attention to in the future as the laws around cyberspace and the expectations of cyberspace develop. I think that might end up being a position at the end of the day is not going to be supportable.
Okay. Anyone else before I ask our last question?
I put in the text. I think it's also important for us to understand some of the context too. I mean, Cybercom has gone through a growth stage, right? I mean, our capabilities in 2015 versus what they are today are significantly different as an organization. So when I hear these kinds of things come into play, I'm not sure even if U.S. Cyber Command had all the authorities and had all, was able to do operations like it can today, back in 2015, it could actually do that. So it was building an organization as it was conducting mission, and it was struggling and fighting to get authorities and get the right people and stuff and get itself going. It's not an indictment on them. It's just a mere reality. So I think we ought to make sure we keep things in context. And an important piece in the end was, the 2019 NDA that finally officially clarified Title 10 versus Title 50 as it relates to cyberspace operations, which is huge because that was one of the things that kept on coming back up about whether or not we could do certain activities. So all those things have come into play now and is getting us in a position to where we can do more. So it'll be interesting seeing where this whole discussion goes over.
Okay, let's ask the last question from Sergeant Whalen, who gave us a great final question. And the second part of his question is, do you feel like we're excluding much of our force from the majority of these conversations? And I don't think anyone could disagree with that. I think we need to have more open conversations about these issues. The classification issue, of course, came out very clearly. And in some ways, I think there's a very great division between the cyber PE academics and the cyber academics in America. That's even greater than the division between the cyber academics in America and the cyber academics in the EU, if you understand my meaning here. So there's a lot to be said about that problem. But I think the simple final question I want to leave you all with for the panel to toss it back to you is, if you can get one message to the DoD in regards to cybersecurity, what would that be? And also, if you want to tell us what you're working on or what sources of information you followed during this war, that would be another way to kind of end things. So I'll go to Sean first because I think his answer will be what I would say. So I'm going to put a lot of pressure on Sean to get it right now.
Oh boy. I think I would say a couple of things. Number one, it's not about Cyber Pearl Harbor. It's not about things going boom primarily. I mean, it's not impossible that cyber could be used for things to go boom, but that's just not the reality of what we've seen. And so we have to focus on reality. And just because there's been no Cyber Pearl Harbor doesn't mean that cyber's not interesting. I think that's the point Jackie made earlier. There's lots of really interesting cyber things happening, but we have to focus on the reality of how cyber is actually being used, how it's being integrated with, I guess I'm not supposed to say IO, I'm supposed to say OIE, how it's being integrated with other elements, of OIE operations. And so that would be my advice is stop fantasizing, stop focusing on fiction, and instead focus on reality.
That's what I would have said, but I would have been meaner. Professor Thomas?
So I would soften that message if it were me. I would say that I don't expect the future to be predicted by the past. This is a constantly changing domain. At the same time, the kinds of cyber Pearl Harbor scenarios that have been painted would be very difficult to achieve, not necessarily for cyber reasons, but even just for intel reasons. It's hard to make a correct prediction of what to do that would create a cascade of effects to create these spectacular long-term effects. That is the one that spent attention getting. That's the one that they've put out in order to get funding. I think that we're going to have to find more persuasive arguments to get attention and funding for this domain. Things like Colonial Pipeline, I think, was an interesting shot across the bow, although many people misunderstand Colonial Pipeline and think it was an attack on the pipeline. So we still need attention to the space. We need, I think, more effective ways to convey the message. Over.
That's a great point too, and I think one of the concerns I might have about the Colonial Pipeline hack is that it really, focuses on the failure of the defense and the inadequate responses of the company that overreacted and shut down the pipelines and caused the problems themselves. And that's kind of a large lesson in cybersecurity, that a lot of the cascading problems that happen in cyber are caused in some ways by the defender. Carl, what's your big lesson for the DoD?
So for me, my big lesson going forward is not just in this conflict, but seeing how things are shaping as we're moving through this, is that I'm very interested in seeing what the United States government wants to do to position itself going forward. If we will continue to turn to U.S. Cyber Command as the go-to agent. I think Jackie put it pretty well earlier. I'm very concerned about the mission creep that eventually happens because DoD has capability that other agencies do not. And I would love to see a more thorough, thoughtful discussion going on at the national level about what is the proper role. And if it is going to become the role, then we have to resource it. And I'm not sure the existing military establishment is going to sacrifice physical capabilities and manpower in order to fund and resource appropriately a cybercom that has to continually expand its mission set. So I think there's some interesting discussions that are going to happen. And in order to do that, though, we really do need military and civilian leaders to get smarter on this. And that will be another piece that I don't know how well we can get them to during this conversation. So those are my two takeaways, and those are the areas I'm continuing to express interest in researching over.
Great, thank you. Hey, Sean, do you have your book handy? Do you want to show people the claw? I keep calling it the claw because I think that's what the image of the book is. From those the games that people have where you have to grab things. So Sean has a great new book out, and another book which that's the Cyber Pearl Harbor book, right? I can't see that closely, but so Sean has two great books out that I encourage people to look at. And I will now toss the last word to Jackie. I've known Jackie for almost 10 years now, probably, and I know it's best to give her the last word. So that's how we'll end today.
Smart man. My husband does not agree. So I would say we need to build better networks and we need to invest in IT. And that is not what the Department of Defense traditionally does. I'm just finishing a book on autonomy, and it's all about kind of the decisions that we make inside the Department of Defense for some types of autonomy versus others. And the overriding lesson is, when possible, we like to buy the platforms that the services love. And IT has always been a footnote to that. And it will continue to be a footnote. And I think what we've seen from Ukraine is that without adaptable and resilient networks of communication, you cannot fight modern warfare. We've been building the networks of the 90s, and we need to be thinking about the networks of 2020 and 2030, which are far more distributed, far more resilient, far less fragile and exquisite. And I think people are starting to understand that, but I don't, doesn't seem to be connected in any way to cyber strategy. Poor Cyber Command and the service cybers have to defend the networks that they are given and the platforms they are given. God help them. And then the final thing is, and this is said every single cyber discussion we have, but I'm going to say it, is we have to focus on people. The manpower is the largest restraint and the largest resource shortage in this domain. And that the DoD continues to put lip service to recruitment and retention when it comes to cyber, where I'm in a Marine room, right? You Marines said you were going to have this like civilian auxiliary force where everyone's going to have purple hair, but like you guys didn't want to pay them and you didn't want to give them clearances. So that idea went to nowhere. Put your money where your mouth is, right? If you really care about people, make changes. That's it.
Very good. Yeah, at the Solarium, we talked a lot about this idea of reserve and auxiliary forces. And the reason it was housed in the military is because they have clearances. And if that's not happening, then the whole purpose and structure of the intent of the idea is lost. And, I think that's the message I would give to the DoD. We need to do better. I totally agree with Sean about the fictions point. I believe all we have is the past. And that's all we can judge from. And if we move from the past and believe that the past will be vastly different from the future, we're going to get the future wrong. And we historically have got the future wrong because we always believe it's going to be transformative and vastly different from how we think. And this myth we tell ourselves has led us down the wrong path. And I can't tell you how many times when I was working for the DoD, I would go meet a general and they would show me a fiction book on cybersecurity as their evidence for what they know about this domain. And I am still horrified to this day, and I hope we do better. With that, I'll leave it to Major Brown.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Valeriano. And yeah, Dr. Horn. Yeah, that's, we all know that one. First of all, I want to say thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining us today for this extended discussion. This is fantastic. Like I said at the beginning, this is one area with our focus on the war in Ukraine that we have not been able to sort of get after. So thank you for helping us fill that void and taking the time to do so from across the various time zones. And definite thanks to Dr. Valeriano for helping put this whole thing together. And since it sounds like you're working on another one, just keep us in the loop, and we'll be happy to facilitate that one again as well and roll us into our series. For everyone out in the audience, thank you for your time today, for sticking around and participating in this panel and sending your questions. We will have we got a number of upcoming episodes, both on the Brutecast itself and some other areas I just want to highlight. Starting with tomorrow, we have the next MES or Middle East Studies Research Talk. That's with Dr. Jason Warner on the Islamic State's expansion in Africa. That'll be tomorrow morning at 1100 Eastern time. And then as well, in talking with Dr. Weber, we should be able to push out another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war tomorrow evening, looking at, I think we're going to talk a little bit about today's draft day for the Russian conscripts, see how that went for them, who got picked, who didn't, and as well as take a larger look at the state of the Russian army today, based on performance and some of the pictures and rumors coming off the battlefield. And then, like I mentioned already, next week we're going to have Dr. Leah Windsor, Team Krulak non-resident fellow, along with Captain Casey Lamar, who's one of our Krulak scholars from over a year ago. Like I said, they've been presenting their research on linguistic analysis to explain the foreign country's alignment with the United States to several large forums, and we're very happy to be able to present their research here next week. That'll be morning of April 8th. So we hope that everybody out there can join us then. And thank you, Dr. Valeriano, and to our panelists, thank you very much today.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.